I think we should get started.
Long time no see.
There are all these people saying hello to each other.
That's right.
Old friends, right? Great. So welcome to the second distinguished speaker of this season. And just before we get started on today's presentation, I want to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Chinooka nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And now it's a pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Dawn Abelson. Most of you already know Dawn, but Dawn is currently Academic Director of the Wilson College of Leadership and Civic Engagement and Professor of Political Science at McMaster University. Dawn teaches and conducts research in the fields of comparative politics, Canada and the US, and international relations. And before joining McMaster in October 2023, he served as the inaugural director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government, the Stephen K. Hudson Chair in Canada-US Relations, and Professor of Political Science at St. Francis Xavier University. Dawn is the author of several books and is editor of several more, as well as author of many journal articles and book chapters. And he regularly appears on various media networks in Canada, the US, Europe, and the Middle East to discuss Canada-US relations and US foreign policy. And today, Dawn is going to talk to us about Life with Brian, lessons from the Mulroney Institute of Government.
Well, thank you so much, Vicki. My thanks to Laura Stevenson for helping make arrangements for me to come today. It's so wonderful seeing all of you, old friends and colleagues. I've been looking forward to this talk for some time. This presentation is based on a SSHRC-funded research project that investigates the common causes of conflict between university-based think tanks or public policy centers and their host institutions. In the book that I'm working on, there are 5 case studies, 3 drawn from the United States, the Hoover-Stanford conflict that has been going on now for decades, the conflict that led to the dissolution of the Center for Strategic and International Studies affiliation with Georgetown University, and the conflict which arose between the Foreign Policy Research Institute that was created in 1955 and split from the University of Pennsylvania around 1970. In Canada, the 2 case studies, the Mowat Centre at the University of Toronto, which unfortunately was forced to close its doors a little over a year or 2 ago, despite the fact that it was doing excellent work, and the Mulroney Institute of Government, which I had a front row seat to for close to 5 years. In many ways, this is a sensitive topic to deal with, in large part because I knew all the players very, very well. And today I'm going to focus really on the relationship between donors, between the Mulroney Institute of Government and St. FX. And what I try to do by pulling myself away from my personal involvement is to try and identify what I believed were the major causes of conflict. Now, you don't often hear this in the news, certainly not around the time of Mr. Mulroney's passing. I was at the funeral. No one from St. FX was invited to speak. There were a few of us there to pay our respects. But it was a very, very shaky relationship. And so there was this narrative floating around that was reinforced by successive presidents at St. FX that Brian Mulroney, as the most famous alumnus from St. FX, graduated in 1959 with a degree in political science, that he would have given his heart and soul to St. FX. And you know what? He would have. But what doesn't come out of the narrative is that he was involved in a very tense relationship with successive university administrations, that he was in a tense relationship with many faculty on campus, and that he was in a tense relationship with the Institute because we had very conflicting goals and priorities. So I decided to write this paper, again, as part of the SHIRT project. Academics have responded very well to it, which I'm very happy with. It's unlikely I'll be on the Christmas card list for the Mulroney family this year, which is okay, I can accept that. But I really wanted to offer it as a cautionary tale, because we're seeing these conflicts arise a little too often. So you would think that two types of organizations, public policy centers and think tanks, and the universities where they are based, two types of institutions ostensibly committed to the pursuit of knowledge, would be able to enter into or form a natural synergy. So if you have public policy research centers doing very interesting work in various political, economic, social, anthropological issues, and they're based at a university and they can bring notoriety to the university and prestige, why is it that we often see them butting heads? What causes the conflict? And how can it be resolved? In the cases that I look at in the book, two instances, FPRI, Foreign Policy Research Institute, and CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, it ended in separation. They couldn't see eye to eye, they couldn't get along. The Hoover-Stanford conflict, which is something I've really wanted to write about now for about 30 years when I first started my doctoral research in this area, has had among the most fractured relationships you could possibly imagine. But I'm going to talk about them later in the talk because I think what they have done might create a way out for the Mulroney Institute. So let's start with some background on the Institute. We're going to identify some of the key tensions and conflicts and talk about a path forward. So if I can get this going, this will introduce you to the Mulroney Institute. Is there sound thing about it? Oh, here we go.
Welcome to the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government at St. Francis Xavier University. In addition to Mulroney Hall being a state-of-the-art teaching and research complex dedicated to the study of leadership, students and visitors will also find on display an extensive collection of artifacts, photos, and audiovisual material from Mr. Mulroney's time as Canada's 18th Prime Minister, including an exact replica of the Prime Minister's office. The Brian Mulroney Institute of Government offers students an opportunity to learn about and prepare for careers in government, the non-governmental community, and the private sector. With access to generous scholarships and bursaries, students enrolled in the Institute's flagship public policy and governance program are taught about the challenges of leadership and the various factors that have and continue to influence key policy decisions at all levels of government. It is Prime Minister Mulroney's hope that students who enter Mulroney Hall will feel inspired to make a positive contribution to the life of our country. It is a vision shared and embraced by the entire St. FX community.
Something happened because it didn't move. So the video worked, but not the audio worked, but not the video. So I'll try to fix that out later on. Okay. So, in 2012, St. FX President Sean Riley approached the most famous alumnus of the university, Brian Mulroney, and he and Tim Lang is the brother of Amanda Lang, who you may have watched on Squeeze Play and other talk shows, went to visit Brian Mulroney and Mila at their home in Palm Beach. And they asked Brian Mulroney, who had done a lot of fundraising for them before, if he would be prepared to spearhead a new fundraising campaign to raise $25 million to replace a dilapidated building on campus called Nicholson Hall. So Mulroney agreed to do it. He had raised millions of dollars for St. FX before. He had raised in excess of $12 million about a decade before for a new aquatic center. He was always maintained close ties to the university. He had thanked the university for giving him his start. He entered St. FX when he was barely 16 years old, and as he often said during public speeches, I arrived on campus with little more than a blazer and a cardboard suitcase. And St. FX wrapped their arms around me and gave me a chance. Very active on campus politically. As he often said, he entered as a liberal, left as a conservative. His friend Frank McKenna entered as a conservative and left as a liberal. So Brian Mulrooney was very much at home at St. FX. He was very much at home in Nova Scotia. His first riding was in Central Nova. So Mulrooney agreed that he would spearhead this campaign for $25 million. And when all was said and done, he had raised $125 million. Mulrooney made it clear from the very beginning that he didn't want St. FX to be out of pocket a dime. So he crisscrossed the globe with his daughter Caroline Mulrooney for 6 years, knocking on doors, seeking out philanthropic foundations, government agencies, private citizens to raise that kind of money. The groundbreaking took place in September 2017. I apologize for this being so blurry. You can see Brian Mulrooney here, former President Ken MacDonald, Sean Fraser, who was a graduate of St. FX and has held a number of cabinet level posts. And so this was a very important time in the history of St. FX. You saw that in the video. Again, I'll try to get it working at the end. So Mulrooney Hall is 100,000 square feet. It occupies the most valuable piece of real estate on the St. FX campus. Mulrooney Institute of Government is on the top floor of Mulrooney Hall. It was interesting. There was a rush to complete the building. I arrived on campus January 1st, 2019, and we'll get into this a bit more. The building was still under construction for about another 6 to 8 months. The Institute was housed in a woman's residence that was scheduled to be demolished within a matter of months. So you can get a sense of how bad that building was. But in negotiating the design of the building, what the university wanted more than anything else was a building that would accommodate enough classrooms to deal with all the courses on campus, or at least most of them. So 100,000 square feet. The lower level, called the Joyce Family Atrium, was modeled after the Kennedy School of Government, where Caroline Mulrooney went. There was a TV studio, again, replica of the Prime Minister's office. From the bottom floor all the way to the top, different interactive pods, displays, and so forth. So the university made it very clear what they wanted, first and foremost, was a building. What Brian Mulrooney wanted, first and foremost, was a way to promote his legacy. So all of a sudden, you began to see the seeds of conflict. And what Mulrooney wanted was what George H.W. Bush had and what Ronald Reagan had. He wanted a presidential-style library and museum. That did not go over well with the administration. It did not go over well with the faculty, so you already began to sense that something wasn't quite right. I remember on one trip, we took several tours of the building when it was under construction, and I was with Brian and Mila, and Caroline was there. And the interactive pods were going up, and they're quite beautiful. Displays and artifacts from his years in office, and you know, it feels like a museum. And Caroline turned to me and she said, "Thank God I reined my dad in." "You reined him in for this?" So she said, "Oh God, what my dad had in mind was 3 times this." They had held onto 2 storage lockers in Montreal in a warehouse 3/4 of the artifacts that he had during his time in office will never be on display. So they were gifted to St. FX, put into storage at the university. But he was thinking about his legacy, the university was thinking more about the practical side of it. we begin to see some of the conflicts arise. This is on one end of the building, so Mulroney Institute of Government. There's a funny story about the lettering. So a day before the official opening in September 2019, Mr. Mulroney gives me a call and he goes, "Is everything good to go?" And I said, "Well, for the most part, sir." He goes, "Well, you sound a little hesitant." I said, "Well, I think there are a few things you're not going to be happy about." He said, "What am I not going to be happy about?" I said, "Well, you're not going to be happy about the lettering because what they've done is they put up silver lettering and it's too small. And so when you pull up in the campus, you don't see it that well. We ended up using the lettering inside the building." He goes, "Well, what do you suggest?" I said, "Well, I'd go black and I'd go twice as large because no one's going to be able to make it out." He goes, "Yeah, you lost it on the phone." And I said, "But I'll leave it to you, and you figure it out. It's your call, but just something to keep in mind." Sure enough, he pulls up, RCMP brings him in. Doesn't even say hello to the president of the university, points at the sign, he goes, "That's got to go. I want it in black twice as large." So you kind of got a sense of what his personality was like very, very early on. Okay. Ribbon cutting ceremony. Again, you have a fascinating event, over 300 people. They spared no expense. And Sean Fraser, Neil O'Brien, Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia and his wife, Stephen McNeil, former Premier of Nova Scotia, delightful person, and a former Western professor, Kevin Walmsley, from Health Sciences, who was provost at the time, is now president of NIPSC. So what was interesting about the event was that, again, it was all about promoting the institute that was barely off the ground as a world-class institution where leaders from around the world would come and lecture. They would offer the courses. Well, it never quite got to that. The day alone, because what Mulroney would say on all the trips to St. X was, "I'm going to bring the best chefs from Montreal to campus," which was a problem because the campus was unionized and they didn't want outside people. "Spare no expense. It's on me. It's on me." Okay. So the chefs from the Ritz showed up, fed over 300 people at a cost of $250,000. And the bill was to be paid after Brian had left the room. So famously, again, didn't start off well. This is a picture of Brian welcoming people to the event. Again, Caroline Mulroney, Steve McNeil, Frank McKenna, my partner Monda Halper right there. I'm in the back with members of the Mulroney family. Brian's graduation photo in 1959, and we're going to talk about that a bit. This was one of the interactive pods, so this was a fun story. So you have these 3 pods on the main floor of Mulroney Hall, not far from the replica of the Prime Minister's office. And this is a computer console, and you can go in and you can actually access it online. But you can look at all the different speeches that gave during his time in office. So the funniest speech, if you ever have a chance to watch, it's actually quite hilarious. It's on Brian Mulroney's humor. You just click on and watch it. So one day, I'm with Mr. Mulroney, we're walking through the main foyer, and there's 2 students in the interactive pond. And they don't see Mr. Mulroney behind. So they're watching him lead a debate in Parliament. And he's going on, he's getting, it's one of these fire and brimstone speeches about the GST. The students seem quite enamored with this. So he goes up to them, taps them on the shoulder, and he goes, "So what do you think? Did I do a good job?" They just freaked out. But that's what he would do. He'd walk into classrooms, he'd see people, and he just really enjoyed that part of it. Again, more interactive pods. Can't see it that well. When he received his Order of Canada, Jean Beliveau, Mulroney, and Rocket Richard. Again, more displays. This painting was done by Ted Kennedy, close friend of his. Prime Minister's office. That was a rep. Mr. and Mrs. Mulroney and some students were always very kind to the students. This was the last time I saw Brian. So this was June 2023. This was an Atlantic Economic Forum, which I'm going to talk a bit about. In the middle is Andy Hagan, current president of St. X, Justin Trudeau, of course. And Brian, by that point, was pretty much on his way out. He had a bout of cancer, prostate cancer that had spread. He had heart trouble. It was amazing that he was able to even attend. And we had our last talk, and what I felt bad about, to be honest, was it was at that conference that I had to tell him that I was leaving St. X and going to McMaster. And he called me at home in English, and he was very, very gracious and understood. But it was hard. It was very, very tough. Especially when you're working with a high-profile person over a 5-year period. Who you get to know quite well. He gets to know you and your family quite well. This was an interesting event. I'll just say one thing before I move on to the thesis of the paper. What Brian wanted to do was to reach out to Justin Trudeau to try and show the audience that there was still an opportunity in our country for bipartisanship, to try and push back on what was happening in the United States. And so Justin Trudeau was in Halifax at the time. He invited him to speak at St. X. Justin Trudeau gave what I thought was a lovely speech. Brian really went out of his way to accommodate him and to pay tribute to him and the challenges that he faced. And the next day when I got to my office, my email was flooded with hate mail from conservatives around the country saying, has Brian Mulroney lost his effing mind? What the hell is going on? Blah, blah, blah. It was just, I thought to myself, here's a person who devoted his life to politics, whether you liked him or you didn't like him, whether you liked his policies or you disagreed with him. But trying to reach out, and that was pretty much the response. So it was, that was a tough film. So here's Brian introducing Justin Trudeau. Again, by that point, he lost about 60 pounds. And Mila has recently become new Chancellor of St. X. I'll talk a bit about that. So let's try and put that in perspective. So you have this gorgeous building to accommodate almost 70% of all the courses offered at St. X. You have a major donor, a major world figure, at a small rural university. How could anything go wrong? What could go wrong? Well, just about everything. It was a perfect storm, and for those of you who are either from the Maritimes or visited the Maritimes, I think I lived through two hurricanes, you'll know what storms feel like. So why was there a perfect storm? One, you had a former prime minister who was completely consumed with safeguarding and protecting his legacy. But more importantly, he had little tolerance for or interest in faculty. For those of you, and I know there are many in the room who, like me, attended the University of Toronto, we were his favorite target. He hated academics. He had nothing but disdain, and every conversation I would have with him would generally start off with Don Brian Mulroney calling, yes sir, how are you? Fine, don't want to offend you, but, and then, it would be an anti-academic tirade. So he was not interested in the faculty. He was not interested in the research. It was all about his legacy. I knew going into this position that the Mulroney name was still very much a lightning rod. And of course, having studied think tanks for over 30 years, I also realized that the only way this institute would have a chance was to build out its research production productivity and credibility. So what I tried to do, and I think we were quite successful, we started a series with McGill Queens University Press. In 4 years, we published 17 titles. In our last year, one of the books by Ryan Maducha won the Donner Prize for the best book in public policy. Mulrooney couldn't care less. He thought it was a complete waste of money. So let me just talk about the money piece first, because this was a huge source of conflict. I said at the beginning of my remarks that he raised $125 million. That's a lot of money. When we think about think tanks in the United States that have that kind of budget, we're thinking about the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation. RAND has a budget of over $300 million. In Canada, you think of the the Balsillie School, the Balsillie CG. They're up about 25, 30 million. 125 million is a lot of money. Well, I get a call, so I arrive on January 1st. About a day later, it's a Sunday. I'm in my car, had my car shipped from London, and the phone rings, and it's Brian Mulrooney. And he goes, "Don, you getting settled in?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." They put me in this terrible residence. Oh my God. It was just unbelievable. I was trying to figure what I'd done wrong. I mean, it was like mud would be coming out of the taps. I mean, it was that bad. And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm getting settled." And he goes, "Well, I need to apologize to you." I said, "For what?" "Sir, I've just started." He goes, "I know that when you were interviewed for this position, you asked a number of senior people at the university what your operating budget would look like." I said, "Yes," and I never received a response. He goes, "Because we don't have one." I said, "I beg your pardon?" He goes, "There is no operating budget." So I froze. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Disrupted my family, disrupted my life. Moved to a new university. I have no operating budget. I said, "Well, if you don't mind me asking, sir, where's the $125 million?" He said, "Well, we poured $70 million into the building. That's a whole other lecture." I said, "Okay." He goes, "I raised $20 million for student scholarships and bursaries. They couldn't spend 20% of it. They didn't have the students, but they had $20 million that was locked up. So that's here at $90 million. $10 million for 2 research chairs, including yours. Okay, we're at $100 million. You got $25 million left." He goes, "Yeah, I think I made an impulsive decision." I said, "Could you elaborate?" He goes, "Well, you know that building next door, Nicholson Tower?" I said, "Yes, sir, I know Nicholson Tower is." He goes, "What faculty are in there?" I said, "Faculty of Arts, Faculty of Humanities, sir." He goes, "Not a single one of those bastards would have voted for me. So I don't know why I made this decision, but," he said, "that is such an incredibly ugly building that I decided that instead of having that building next to my gorgeous complex, I agreed to give them $20 million to refurbish it, including the outside." At that point, the fate of the Mulrooney Institute had been sealed. So I said, "Well, what do you expect me to do, sir? I'm good, I'm not that good." And he said, "Well, we're going to create an advisory board, an external advisory board. We're going to populate it with the sons and daughters of millionaires and billionaires. And every year they're on the board, they're going to contribute $100,000 each. I figure there's 6 to 8 members on the board, $800,000, will that do you for the next little while?" I said, "If you give me a budget of $800,000, I think we can do a lot of good things." Caroline can't run it because she's in politics, as you know. My son Mark, who's at Scotiabank VP, he's going to take it over. Have you met Mark? "Yes, sir, I've met Mark." Oops. Don't think it's, oh, thank you. He goes, he's going to head it up. So it took 1.5 years for the board to be populated. 1.5 years. Meanwhile, we have to figure out how to raise the profile of an institute without an operating budget. So with the assistance of my friend, Kevin Walmsley, we figured we could use the interest generated from endowed chairs that hadn't been filled. So that constituted our budget. Once the advisory board was populated, it was a complete and utter disaster. Not a single member contributed dime. We held only 2 meetings. One was an hour during COVID. The second one was a half hour. Both times, Brian and Mila sucked up all the oxygen in the room, never got to the strategic priorities of the Institute, and more importantly, no money donated. So that was a major source of conflict. Now, it gets even better. The university had no plan B because they expected that Brian had such an extensive network of wealthy contacts that he could raise as much money as he wanted. There was no budget line at the university, nothing, not a dime. And so, from the very beginning, the Institute was plagued by chronic budgetary issues. They never got over it. And whatever money came our way, I made the decision to pour it into research and into faculty positions. The one contribution that the advisory board made was to bring Brian to Toronto at one point. He gave a luncheon address. They raised about $500,000, and the bulk of that money went into establishing a visiting fellows program that Brian insisted that we use to bring in his old buddies from the conservative years to meet with students. That money dried up very, very quickly. Second thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact that the university itself simply was not prepared to absorb a public policy institute. The research culture was not there. St. X, what it does, I think it does well, which is be an effective teaching institution, a small teaching institution. It was not prepared to embrace a research-oriented institute. And I could sense that the first week I was on campus. I gave addresses to all the different faculties because I realized, based on my past experience, that unless you have campus buy-in, it's going to be very, very hard to run an institute like this. The other issue that was important was that there were clearly conflicting goals and priorities, as I had already stated. And the senior administration didn't want to get its hands dirty. And over time, as Brian would constantly call and say, why isn't this an institutional priority? They would say, no, sir, of course it is. Don knows it is. He said, no, there's no budget line. There is no priority. He went from being the goose that laid the golden egg to an albatross around their neck. And as his health declined, he became less and less relevant. And so all of a sudden, you have this institute that started off with great potential, great promise, and it ends up going in an opposite direction because of too many broken promises. The 3 areas I want you to think about, and then we'll move on. 1, there were no proper channels of communication that were established from the very beginning. The only message that I was given was never offend Mr. Mulroney. Otherwise, do whatever you want. Just do not offend him. Well, by virtue of not offending a former prime minister, the 18th Prime Minister of Canada invariably means that someone's going to be offended. And it's going to be you. Because he's calling nonstop. He wants things done. I can't offend him, so the administration is going to be the next target. Well, they didn't like that very much either. They were afraid to establish proper channels of communication because they didn't want to put him off. They didn't want to bite the hand that was feeding him. So there were no channels. There were, we talk about Trump having no guardrails. Mulroney had no guardrails. The first month I was there, he brought up with me the fact that one of my colleagues, who I will not name, had written an article in Maclean's in the early 80s, shortly after, or mid-80s, shortly after Mulroney became prime minister, that was critical of him. He called me up. He said, "Are you aware of this guy?" I said, "Yes, sir. He's a colleague of mine." "What do you think of him?" I said, "He's a very productive, very decent person." He goes, "I want you to fire the son of a bitch." I said, "Sir, for God's sake." I said, "You know that?" I said, "You're a labor lawyer. You know you can't do that." "God damn it!" So he'd lose it, right? So, sometimes Monda's there and she's hearing the folks, she's like, "He's losing his shit." I said, "Yeah, no kidding." So this was one of the things, no proper channels of communication. St. X was largely indifferent to the Institute. I had senior administrators say to me, "We avoid Mulroney Hall at all costs." because it's nothing more than a shrine. We don't want to go through it, and I had a senior administrator say to me, quite frankly, every time I walk through it, it makes me physically sick. Not a good position to have when you're trying to build an institute. And the other thing that I talk about in the research is, and again, no offense to the university intended, but there was a culture of complacency. And as hard as my colleagues and I tried to convey that this is an incredible gift that will help build the university's profile, that will give them notoriety, they couldn't buy into it. They just couldn't, and indeed wouldn't. So when you look at the main causes of conflict, they're clearly there. Budgetary issues, personality issues, conflicting goals and priorities, chronic budgetary problems, they're all there. It's not surprising that they came together and to the point that the Institute was really hamstrung in terms of what it could accomplish. So the question then became, in my mind, given Mulroney's capacity to raise that kind of money, $125 million, why did you go in this direction? Why didn't you go in the direction of Ed Broadbent or a Preston Manning and set this up as a private foundation? You could have done it in any city in the world. Broadbent has a successful institute in Toronto, Manning in Calgary. Why not do that? You have complete control. You can hire and fire whoever you want. You don't have to worry about university governance. You don't have to worry about unions. You don't have to worry about regulations. It's yours. Do what you want. Why didn't you do it? One of the reasons he didn't do it was he wanted the cachet of being at a university. Now, two other universities put in significant bids for the Mulroney Institute. McGill, Mulroney had lived in Montreal for years, and here, Western. Western made a significant bid for the Institute. Remember years ago when Mulroney got an honorary degree? It was during that time that the administration and the advancement office made a pitch, saying we'd like to bring the Mulroney Institute to Western. His emotional bond to St. FX was too strong. He also knew that if he had built the Mulroney Institute at Western or at McGill, he would not be treated the way he would have been treated at St. FX, or so he thought. He'd prefer to be a bigger fish in a small pond than competing with other priorities at much larger and more prestigious universities. So what option do they have? Well, one of the options, of course, but again, it depends on a lot of resources, is you pull up stakes and you just say this relationship hasn't worked. We're going to decide to move on. Problem is, the Prime Minister has passed away. I don't think this is a priority for the family. Mila has indeed become Chancellor, and I know that Brian left some money in his estate for the university. How much, I do not know. But I think if they could, they would. I think the more realistic option, again, there's going to have to be a lot of fundraising behind it, is for the Mulroney family to think about the model of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. So many, many years ago, as a result of an ongoing conflict that began to emerge when Herbert Hoover became involved back in 1919, was they were able to convince the Stanford administration to allow Hoover to be really an independent institution within the framework of Stanford. So they have the cachet of being at Stanford, but they're regulated autonomously. Now, whether or not St. FX and the St. FX Board of Governors would be prepared to do that, I don't know. But the path that they're on now isn't going to be able to be sustainable. When I left, they advertised for a new director. They decided to make the position internal because they couldn't afford it. This is the type of investment that will require an infusion of millions of dollars. So unless there is a donor out there that I'm unaware of, or the Mulroney family has, an ace up their sleeve, this institute will never fulfill the vision of its founder. And for me, yes, does it make for an interesting case study? It does. But I find it deeply troubling because I wanted nothing more than for it to work and to succeed. So it's important, again, as a cautionary tale to think about what are the things that can go right and what can go wrong when bad decisions are made. And the problem is, by the time those decisions were made, there's very little left that could be done. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to be happy to answer any questions you have. But again, I don't present this, as some of my critics have said, to reopen old wounds. It's about really trying to shine a spotlight on institutes that I feel very strongly about because I know what kind of contribution that they can make, and I saw this as a failed opportunity. So let me stop there, and again, happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much. Eddie.
Very interesting, Don. I was interested in this idea of the legacy that the former Prime Minister was so interested in, and I was trying to, all of the precedents you cited were American ones, President Bush and Hoover and
Reagan.
Kennedy Institute and everything. I was trying to go through my mind of Canadian Prime Ministers. Are there any? I couldn't think of any who had anything remotely like what he had. So, why was this the idea that he had to have something that no other prime minister had?
Right. So you're absolutely right. Of course, there are schools and some exhibits named after former prime ministers, but nothing on this scale. But you really have to go back to his early years in Baie-Comeau. And you know, Mulroney grew up very poor. His father was an electrician. He grew up in a pulp and paper town. Irish Catholic, French Catholic family. And the person who started the town of Baie-Comeau, who was a former editor of the Chicago Tribune, used to give Brian $50 at a time if Brian would sing songs at the local pub, which Brian would do regularly. He always felt that in order to be a true success, you had to be successful in the United States. That Canada was a wonderful country, a great country. But if you really wanted to make it, you had to make it in the United States. Fast forward to when Reagan was prime minister. Reagan had a relatively tense relationship with Pierre Trudeau. Mulroney, as opposition leader, is invited to the White House to meet Reagan for the first time. They hit it off. They gave a press conference in the Rose Garden. And Mulroney was a strong believer that the only way that Canada's stature on the world stage could grow is if they had a very strong bond with the United States. So from a very early time in his political career, he associated himself with presidents who were successful, so he thought, and he wanted his legacy to be as the best prime minister in Canadian history managing the Canada-US file. And he used to say, and he'd say in public all the time, next to the file on federal-provincial relations, the most important file that a prime minister will ever have to deal with is the Canada-US file. He had in his mind, here was a person who got out of office, the Conservatives had been decimated within a short period of time. He had moved his household to Palm Beach. He had been a successful executive before. He and his family would stay in Kennebunkport every summer with the Bush family, maintain close relationships with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. He saw himself as part of that exclusive club. And what he wanted more than anything else was to stand out from every other prime minister. He had a terrible relationship with Stephen Harper. He had a terrible relationship with Jean Chrétien. So before the funeral, I got a call from his first cousin with whom I had a good relationship. And he said, John, you'll be at the funeral in Montreal, but I'm glad that, he'd always just call him a PM, it was his first cousin. I'm glad the PM made up with Jean Chrétien, because I had notes from him saying if Chrétien showed up to his funeral, to stop the funeral and have him ushered out. I was on we were shuttle bused, to Notre Dame Cathedral, and Lucy and Bouchard, I walked onto the bus, and it was like a who's who in the political class. Lucy and Bouchard's there, hello, Bob Ray, and they're all there. But he was very, very much committed to making sure that his legacy would honor the ties he had with the United States, and what better way for him to do it than to have this mammoth structure built that played up his relationship with the United States. And he would always say, just what you did. There's no other prime minister who has it. I want it. And he was very committed to it. There's no doubt about it. Other questions? Adam?
Do you think on that, like for St. FX, was this like a good deal in the sense that they at least, they got all these buildings,
Yeah.
they got some scholarships? I don't know contractually how long you have to keep it as the Mulrooney Institute, or
Yeah.
is it, X number of years and then they just do what they want with it, or?
Yeah. I think it was a great deal for them. And I think part of the problem, and this was shocking to me, given the fact that he had made millions of dollars in the private sector, that he did not insist that in order for St. FX to get the $125 million, he wanted to see some commitment from the university. They didn't put up a dime. So, to give you a different example, can't tell you all the details, but that is not how the relationship works between the college that I had and the administration, because the university's an equal partner. So, if you don't have any skin in the game, right? You've done so much work on this, on business government relations. If you have no skin in the game, what kind of leverage do you have? He had no leverage over them. He had the narrative, but he had no leverage. So they got the building, they got the scholarships of $20 million in student scholarships, which means they have to give away $800,000 a year. They don't have the student population to do that. He had set up 2 scholarships, one for Mila Mulrooney to attract students of African Nova Scotian descent, another one to attract students, indigenous students. There was 0 take-up. 0. Some of the bursaries, yes. Some of the other scholarships, yes. But there was so much money, but it wasn't in an envelope that could benefit the Institute. It was locked in. So he would often call and say, oh, I've got a lead on so-and-so who's prepared to set up a scholarship. I said, enough with the scholarships. We can't spend what we have. We need money to operate the Institute, to keep the lights on, to hire faculty, to do research. And he's like, it was always the same line. Why would I give you money to do more research? Academics don't know a goddamn thing. That was the response. So I would say, but sir, you do know that 100 years from now, political scientists and historians aren't going to be writing about your letters. Yeah, well, anyway. So that was a lost cause. But again, conflicting goals and priorities. I think the university did well. But I think it was a greatly missed opportunity to really use it to build something special. Joe?
Oh, sorry, I was kind of wavering on it. I guess then, why the Institute in the first place then?
Yeah.
Right? If the university approached him for a building,
yeah.
He wasn't interested in an institute, how did this come about?
Right. So, what he had in mind was, first of all, he wanted a school of public affairs. Laval is now in the process of raising $100 million for a school of international affairs. One of our former Western students, Jonathan Paquin, will become the incoming director of the Brian Mulrooney School of International Affairs at Laval. He got it in his mind that he could create a school of public policy, international affairs, and by virtue of the connections he had to world leaders, they could come and offer brief courses. So one of the selling features of it was, to him, oh geez, I'll have Tony Blair, I'm going to have Barack Obama, I'm going to have Bill Clinton, I'm going to get them all here. Not a single one of them came. The only person who came was Justin Trudeau. Mulrooney, Trudeau. That was it. Now, of course, you have to take into consideration COVID and all of that, but that was never going to work. Why the Institute? Again, the Institute was linked initially to the 4-year interdisciplinary program in public policy and governance. The problem that he didn't understand was actually you couldn't link it to the Institute because the Institute wasn't a faculty. The program had to be part of the Faculty of Arts. So when he would say to me, well, we control the program, I said, no, sir, actually we don't. That's in the Faculty of Arts. Well, that's got to change. It's not going to change. So that, again, proper channels of communication, what you could expect from the university, what you couldn't expect. And his first cousin would often say to me, I was pleading with him for years, don't do this. Don't do it. Set it up privately, do something else. Don't do this. Was it narcissism? Was it something else? But he couldn't help himself. And it's sad because when you think of that kind of money and what it could have done, and he would use the same line time and time again. If just one student walks through this building and feels inspired by what one of their own did, one day we could have another great prime minister. I said, sir, I hope that happens. I hope that happens many times. It's not realistic, right? You can have a leadership program. You have an engagement program, which we're doing now at MAC. But you've got to focus on more than finding the next prime minister. Just a different vision, competing agendas, and it was tough. It was tough. So we did what we could.
I don't know much about how these fundraising things have
Yeah.
to go with the current budgetary situation anymore. But isn't like what when corporations donate and stuff, isn't it similar? Like I would have thought there'd be like a lot of this kind of stuff would be about arm's length relationships, and here's where you can't call up and fire somebody or decide what's going to be taught in the course. Like
Right.
would it have to be spelled out contractually somehow, or like in terms of the agreement between SFX and.
Yeah, it would have to, it would depend on, who they're negotiating with, but this was the interesting thing. Well, Rooney never checked with St. FX when he was on his fundraising expedition for 6 years. He didn't call up the president saying, I'm about to meet one of the sons of the Koch Foundation, which he did. I got a check for $1 million in my pocket. I'm not checking with St. FX. These are my friends. A lot of it was loosey-goosey. It was just, he wanted his hands on the money. And he wanted to build a building, and he wanted to do other things. But again, my main criticism of all of this, and I said to many colleagues there, what should have happened is 2 years before you even began to break ground. The university, and I had this conversation with Kevin Walmsley. I said, Kevin, you should have reached out to people who've had experience doing this, setting up institutes, people who are familiar with think tanks. It doesn't even have to be me, because I have colleagues all around the world, and to get their input. There was no conversation about it. There was no effort to reach out. If you're undertaking such a huge initiative, wouldn't you want to consult with people? Another problem, Paul Rooney hated consultants, unless he was the consultant. So it was at every turn. So yeah, you could step back and say, well, yeah, logically this should have happened. It didn't. When I said to him, sir, are you telling me that no one at St. FX ever sat down and actually thought about where the money for the operating budget was going to come from? He goes, yeah, we never had that conversation. I said, oh my God, as a kid when I was 5 years old, I had a lemonade stand. I had money set aside. What are you talking about? For someone so smart, that's a really bad decision. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how this case fits, with the other ones you're working on in the book. But
Yeah.
Like, this is an observation. I don't know if the cameras are rolling, right? But this is more like university governance gone wrong, right? Like this is.
Yes.
Like I don't know what's up with those other institutes, but you see, like. In my observation is in the university, everyone, if they get appointed to an administrative position, they're
Right.
like, well, I don't really want to do this. I would rather be doing research.
Right.
And then, they're all of a sudden in charge of a lot of people and a lot of money. They have really no interest in doing it, and they have no they're experts in their field, but they're not experts in how to be an administrator.
That's correct, and that's why I made my point before, that I don't believe the university was prepared for this. You know, it's one thing if you're going to Western, it's one thing if you're going to McGill or UBC or U of T or Queens that have a lot of experience with this. The culture wasn't there. The infrastructure hadn't been built to accommodate it. Because on paper, it makes no sense. One of the institutes that I've written extensively about over my career is the Caledon Institute, Social Policy. In Ottawa, focuses on social welfare benefits, child welfare benefits. Their budget has rarely cracked $1 million. They're the most successful public policy think tank in those two fields than any other one in Canada. That's $1 million, not 125. So why not build a building that's $30 million, $40 million, and use the rest for something else? I hate to say it, because I was fond of him. His narcissism got the better. It did. And he wanted, that big building, impressive, that financiers around the world would come and say, oh, Jesus, it's unbelievable. Yeah, it is unbelievable. But what's unbelievable is it's going to hobble along for the next several decades. No need. Sorry, Vicki, and then I'll go to Andrea. Vicki.
So just to clarify, none of the money was his, right? Like did he donate? Or
Yes. So
okay.
he put up the first $1 million. But that was the other thing that was interesting. He'd give public speeches and he said, well, I threw in the first $1 million. Yeah. What you failed to point out is you wrote 10 checks for $100,000. And then he'd say, $1 million here, $1 million there, it adds up after a while. Yeah, okay. So the Stephen K. Hudson chair, that was the worst. That was my name chair. We had to turn ourselves into pretzels to get the money, and I met the donor in Palm Beach when we were visiting with Brian and Mila. That was a nightmare. Nightmare. So again, broken promises. But he did put in $1 million over 10 years, so the estate would have to cover the remaining amounts. How much he left in his estate, I have no idea. Andrew.
Thanks, Don. At the outset of the presentation, you mentioned Mowat, and
Yeah.
even though it's now closed, I always saw Mowat as a reasonably successful institute, and that was because of clear strategic priorities, a clear policy alignment, specifically with questions of federalism, and great relations with the Ontario government.
Right.
Professionally staffed, but still a research and very university-centered.
Correct.
But even though it's closed, do you see that as a model or a successful template for a policy institute at a university, or is this just something that Canada has not yet and may not be able to do?
Yeah, no, I do, and I was always a big fan of what the Mowat Center did. They had wonderful people, interesting research, and the one thing I admired about them most is that public policy institutes have a tendency to exaggerate how much impact or influence they have. Mowat was the only institute in the entire country that in their annual report would not only list the number of meetings that they had with policymakers and the nature of the meetings, but what was actually achieved during those meetings. There's only one think tank that I can think of in the United States at the state level called the Mackinac Center in Midland, Michigan that does the same. Their magazine is called Impact. And all too often we buy into this narrative that, if you have money, you have influence. It's not true. It's really not true. CG has never reached its potential. With all the money that they don't have that visibility or notoriety. I think what Mowat did was terrific. But the key to all of this is, and it's a cardinal sin that most institutes fall victim to, is you must have a sustainable budget. Whether that budget is $200,000 or $2 million, it needs to be sustainable. Because if it's not sustainable, you're always going to be forced to try and piece together different pots of money. And that is going to detract from your mission and your mandate. So I love the Mowat model. And you also, but here's the problem. MOAT was set up to provide advice to the Ontario government. So there are a group of think tanks that we refer to as government contractors, government specialists, like RAND, like the Urban Institute. When your relationship goes south with a government contract or with a government agency or department, as the National Council of Welfare experience, as the North-South Institute, which used to be the Byward Market experience, you're in trouble. You need to have a diverse source of funding. So it's all well and good if you've got a long-term contract with the government like RAND does and a budget in excess of $300 million. But if you're a relatively small body and something goes awry, there are budgetary pressures, and they cut back, you're in trouble. Mulrooney, first time I met him, shortly after I was hired, they flew me down to Montreal to meet him in his law office. And I wish they had filmed it, because you could show it to every union in Canada of how not to conduct an interview. Every mistake you could make, every politically incorrect thing you could say took place within about an hour and a half. But he said to me, I'm curious about one thing. Why the hell do you study think tanks? I gave some reason. It's the last time we ever talked about it. Well, I don't know if he ever was informed about a chapter I wrote in a book called Do Think Tanks Matter, but in the 1992 Canadian federal budget, Mulrooney closed over 24 think tanks in Canada, including the Law Reform Commission, the Economic Council of Canada, the Science Council of Canada, the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security. He closed them all. So you didn't have someone, I'm not saying he wasn't bright, very, very bright, but there's a difference between being bright and having an intellectual curiosity. He didn't have an intellectual curiosity. He didn't have an intellectual bent. We, in the academic community, were seen as enemies, not allies. And that's not a good way to proceed. Yes?
So I have some experience from years ago working with CPRN.
Yes, of course.
Judith
Yes.
Maxwell and
Absolutely.
And that folded under
It did.
Harper.
Yes.
And morphed into something called CPNet,
Yes.
which we founded as a university-based think tank
Yes.
here.
Yes.
And quite like your experience,
Yeah.
this institution wasn't ready for what that meant in terms of the intellectual relationship.
Yeah.
And it took about 10 minutes to develop conflict around the scholarship, what it would say, and how it would be branded.
Yes.
And it took about 2 years for the whole project to ultimately conclude. But it sounds like your experience didn't involve any tension over the book series with McGill Queens. It was left alone. It was the scholars could do what they wanted to do.
They could, and I worked very closely with the press to identify authors. I set the mandate for the series. Mulrooney had no input into the series because he had no interest. No interest. So that, to me, I was probably the most proud of. I really was. I think we did a lot, over 4 years. The conflict was this, and I took it to heart. And, I have a pretty thick skin. I've been around the block a few times. I showed you the photo of Brian welcoming Justin Trudeau. As part of his introductory remarks, and I was sitting 10 feet away. And he welcomed all the delegates, and he began by saying, I'm so glad that the Mulrooney Institute could host this important conference, the first of its kind in Atlantic, Canada. It's a hell of a lot better than the goddamn research that these professors do that no one gives a crap about. And I'm sitting there and my jaw dropped open. And I thought to myself, you son of a bitch. I said, I have turned myself into a freaking pretzel for 4 years. I've given my blood, sweat, and tears to you and to a university where I've had no roots at all. And this is the payback. I was humiliated more times than I can keep track of. When I talked about the book series before an audience and people were clapping, he actually interjected and said, you don't have to applaud that loud. Christ, it's not like it's Valley of the Dolls. They're not exactly bestsellers. And I thought, oh my God, where do I go from here? So again, all the ducks really have to be aligned for these institutes to work well, right? You need people reading from the same page. And of course, you're going to have conflicts along the way. You hope that you can manage them in an intelligent way. But sometimes they just can't be because the personalities get in the way. And that's why I went to SSHRC for this funding, because so few people have been writing about university-based think tanks and the conflicts that they experience. And I sent the paper that I wrote to Ian Brody, and Ian wrote back, he said, "Oh God, Don, I read your paper," and he said, "It confirms everything I've ever experienced dealing with university-based think tanks." But the truth hurts. Laura.
So this story, I mean, you've mentioned narcissism, so
Yeah.
there's that, but how much do you find that a factor in the other cases that you look at?
Good question. Great question. So it doesn't, I would say the only other case that I see it factoring into is the Foreign Policy Research Institute. When you look at Hoover and Stanford, and that's the most fascinating case because it's gone on for so long. And there was a political scientist who chaired the department for many years, unfortunately passed away about 5 years ago, named John Manley. And I spoke with him years ago. I hope to get down to Stanford, where I've been many times, to interview him. He kept, and I have exhaustive research on this, handwritten notes over a 30-year career about every conflict that ever arose between Stanford faculty and the Hoover Institution. Rarely did narcissism or personality conflicts come up. It was more about institutional encroachment, autonomy, independence, the politicization of policy expertise. It is a fascinating, fascinating case. Georgetown and CSIS, the problem there was really around fundraising. CSIS was becoming too successful. That's when people like Kissinger and Brzezinski and other famous people were working out of the Georgetown campus. And the president of Georgetown at the time, Father Healy, said this is crazy. They were running a fundraising campaign for Georgetown. Donors were calling up and they were saying, we love this organization that's closely linked to Reagan, started in 1962 by a former Navy officer named David Asher. We love what they're doing. They're in the media all the time. They're great. And then Father Healy thought to himself, oh my God, no. Too much of the money is being diverted from our campaign to CSIS. And then what happened was they struck a committee populated by international scholars who made the recommendation that the two part. And that's what ended up happening. I've done a lot of work out of the Georgetown University archives. They will not give me this 5-page report. So I've been able to get most of the stuff out of the president's office. And I said, I just want to see the report. And I said, I'm sorry, the president won't release it. I became friends with the archivist. And I said, have you seen the report? She goes, yeah, it's on my computer. And I said, you're killing me here. She goes, if I could, Don, I would. It would cost me my job. I can't. I'd love to see that thing. So it's a great question. The Mulrooney Institute would fall into a category that I termed many years ago called a vanity think tank, which is set up to advance the legacy and history, a record of former leaders. But the other think tanks that I look at, Mowat Center for Sir Oliver Mowat, no, had nothing to do with narcissism. Had to do with government pressure to cut back. But in terms of productivity and how good their work was, top drawer. Charles.
It's all very interesting. Just one question about the future. I thought you said you think he's going to limp along for a few decades or something. I mean, what's likely to be the long term?
A lot is going to depend on what Mulrooney left to them. So they're going to be okay on the scholarship front, right? So they can continue to attract students. So long as they don't expand the number of faculty they have, they'll be okay. They already have their building. What's going to suffer is the research. So when I was there, we did a few things. The McGill Queen series that did, I thought, remarkably well. I set up a fellows program, reaching out to faculty across campus to become part of the institute, to become ambassadors, to give public lectures, to write, publish occasional papers. Set up a visiting fellows program for former policymakers who could come in and spend some time with students. But I don't sense the commitment to the research side, so I think that's going to fall apart. I really do. And I think ultimately it's going to end up being an undergraduate place that you go, that you have some affiliation with, that you can get some money, perhaps to work with one of the professors there, but I don't see it beyond that. I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't see it.
Can I just ask a follow-up relating to the estate? And
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned earlier on that he made a lot of money in the private sector.
Yes.
If all this is true,
Yep.
why was he taking suitcases full of cash from Karl-Heinz Schreiber? And how much impact did that have on the whole thing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. No, it's a very fair question. I mentioned earlier on in the presentation that, of course, the Mulrooney name continues to elicit, a mixture of responses. I wrote several articles after he passed away. I thought they were fair. His family did not. There's no mention in the entire floors, all 4 floors of Mulrooney Hall, that Karl-Heinz Schreiber ever existed. There is no Airbus scandal. That never happened. It raises very interesting questions for public historians when a former prime minister is not only able to choose the artifacts that he wants displayed, but the narrative that accompanies them.
Sorry, directly related to
Yeah.
that. Did he greenwash his prime ministership? I saw there was one slide that had a CBC tagline, the greenest prime minister ever.
Yes, so he was very proud of that. So if you go on to the Mulrooney Institute website and go under videos, because that's where the video page is, that's part of he'll have a speech about accepting the award for the greenest prime minister ever. So one of his closest friends became Elizabeth May. Why was he voted the greenest prime minister ever? Because of the acid rain agreement that he struck with George H.W. Bush. But just to go back to Andy for a second, so I learned very early on names and issues I could not talk about. I was pulled aside, said you cannot, in his company, you don't bring these people up. You never obviously talk about Airbus because that didn't happen. So blah, blah, blah. I've missed your last part.
If he had all this money, why
Right.
was he taking it, and what the impact was on the whole thing?
Well, the impact was that, the university felt that they wanted to build the narrative around one of their own who came to the university with modest means and reached the apex of political power. That's the narrative that they wanted. What they didn't want was anything controversial. Faculty are not stupid. They didn't like the idea of a major building being named for Mulrooney. And it was a huge division. So, the problem I had with it was, okay, you've raised all this money, you have all of these artifacts in Montreal, you have received a very handsome charitable tax receipt for all of these things that you've been storing at your expense for the past several years, and you are allowed to approve all of the panels, the written panels that accompany the artifacts. And if there's anything that you don't like, that comes out. Well, public historians would have a field day with this. So, they would say, if you want to do that, have a private museum, not something that is at a public institution. So there was just a lot of control. Again, he thought he could get away with murder, and in many ways he did, until he became irrelevant. And that's when the university began to turn its back. So the I was in the unenviable position, and I'm not a crime victim, I was not a victim, of trying to make sure he remained content without trying to alienate the university. He didn't employ me, the university did. It was just a very difficult thing, and it would be difficult for anyone who was in that position. Any other final questions? If you're interested in this, the paper that I wrote is called So You Want to Run a Think Tank, which is really a working paper in draft form published by an international body called On Think Tanks. So just Google it. St. FX is very, very upset with me these days, as my good friend and colleague Andrea Lawler knows, because the paper appears to be generating a little too much attention, and at times appears even before the Mulroney Institute website. So, as Chancellor Mila is not terribly happy, and I'm probably persona non grata, but that's okay. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. It's meant a lot to me, and I hope you find this interesting, because to me, it just raises so many interesting questions about research, university governance, and the role of political leaders, and how we make sense of this, and how we as independent scholars try and think about their legacy in a way that is accurate and intelligible. So it's something I've always been interested in, and it's a sensitive topic, but at this stage of my career, I'm prepared to do it. So, thank you so much.